In 1863, along the humid lowlands of South Carolina, in a parish where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient oaks, a woman named Ruth set fire to the First Baptist Church of Edgefield County, while her master and his wife knelt in prayer inside. The flames consumed not only two lives, but the carefully constructed myth of Southern Christian benevolence, revealing the volcanic rage that simmered beneath every forced smile, every bowed head, every whispered "Yes, Master," that echoed through the slave quarters of the Confederacy. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South. These are not tales of glory or romance, but accounts of moral collapse, of a system so corrupt, transformed human souls into instruments of their own damnation. The Ashford plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of rich Carolina soil, its fields heavy with cotton that would never reach market. In that terrible year of war, Colonel Marcus Ashford, 53 years old, had inherited the property from his father and expanded it through calculated marriages and ruthless business practices that made him wealthy even by the standards of the planter aristocracy. He was a man of peculiar contradictions, educated at the College of Charleston, fluent in Greek and Latin, a vestryman of the church, and yet capable of extraordinary cruelty when his authority was questioned. His face was angular and severe, marked by deep lines that spoke not of laughter but of constant calculation. He wore his graying hair, long in the old style, and possessed a voice that could shift from honeyed persuasion to cold command in a single breath. His wife, Constance Ashford, was 41, the daughter of a Savannah shipping merchant who had married into the planter class with all the zeal of a convert to a new faith. She was pale and thin, corseted so tightly that she seemed to move through the world as if perpetually holding her breath. Her education had been thorough in the ornamental arts expected of a lady, poetry and watercolors and French, but it had left her utterly unprepared for the moral complexities of managing a household built on human bondage. She compensated for this confusion with rigid adherence to religious doctrine and an almost pathological need to see herself as a beneficent mistress, blind to the terror her husband inspired and the suffering her comfort required. The Ashford property held approximately 180 enslaved people, their labor generating the wealth that maintained the big house with its Doric columns and imported furniture, the carriages and fine clothes, the elaborate dinners, where neighboring planters gathered to discuss politics and the progress of the war that was slowly strangling their world. Among these enslaved souls, there existed a small group whose proximity to the master's family had granted them neither privilege nor protection, but rather a more intimate knowledge of the family's darkness. Ruth was 32 years old in that fateful year, a woman of medium height, with strong shoulders and hands scarred from years of labor. She had been born on the plantation, the daughter of a field hand who died of fever when Ruth was 7, and a father she never knew, though plantation gossip suggested he might have shared the Ashford bloodline. Her skin was the color of polished mahogany, her eyes dark and watchful, capable of a blankness that unnerved even the overseers. She worked as a house servant, responsible for the kitchen, the laundry, and the endless tasks that kept a great house functioning. She could read, having been taught in secret by an elderly slave woman who remembered different times, and this literacy made her dangerous in ways the Ashfords never suspected. Working alongside Ruth were 7 others whose lives would become entangled in the tragedy. There was Samuel, 45, the head coachman, a man of dignified bearing, who had once driven the colonel's father and who maintained an almost supernatural composure even as he watched his own children sold away one by one. Dina, 28, worked as a seamstress and lady's maid to Constance, her nimble fingers creating the elaborate dresses that proclaimed Ashford wealth, while her own children wore rough homespun. Young Thomas, 19, served as a houseboy and a stable hand, his face still bearing the innocence of youth, despite the horrors he had witnessed. Esther, 51, was the cook, a woman whose skills kept her valuable, but whose age had begun to make the Ashfords discuss her future usefulness. Moses, 36, worked as a carpenter and blacksmith, his intelligence evident in the quality of his work, and equally evident in the caution with which he moved through the world. Clara, 23, laundered and cleaned, a pretty woman, whose attractiveness had made her a target of the colonel's attention more than once. And finally, there was Benjamin, 62, the oldest among them, a man who had survived by making himself invisible, by knowing when to speak and when to vanish into the background like smoke. The catalyst for catastrophe arrived not with drama, but with the quiet inevitability of rot spreading through sound timber. It began in the autumn of 1862, when Colonel Ashford, facing the financial pressures of war and blockade, made a decision that would seal his fate. Unable to sell his cotton and watching his liquid assets evaporate, he turned to the flesh market with renewed enthusiasm, determining to breed his enslaved population more systematically to create a renewable source of capital. But there was a particular fixation in his plan, a eugenic fantasy dressed in the language of animal husbandry. He believed that by controlling reproduction, by selecting the strongest men and most compliant women, he could create a superior class of slaves that would restore his fortune when the war ended. Ruth became central to this scheme, not by choice, but by the colonel's observation that she possessed intelligence, physical strength, and the quality he mistakenly interpreted as docility. In reality, Ruth's compliance was a mask worn for survival, beneath which burned a rage so pure and focused that it had sustained her through years of degradation. The colonel informed her, in the paternalistic language he favored, that she would be matched with Samuel, a coupling he believed would produce valuable offspring. There was no discussion, no acknowledgement that Ruth might have feelings or desires of her own. She was breeding a stock, and the transaction was explained to her as if she should feel honored by the attention. Pause for a moment and reflect on this transformation of human beings into instruments of profit, into creatures whose very capacity for love and family was weaponized against them. The institution of slavery required not just physical bondage, but a systematic denial of humanity so complete that even reproduction became a form of violation. Ruth said nothing when the colonel outlined his plan. She nodded as expected, lowered her eyes, and returned to her duties. But that night, in the quarters, she gathered the others. They met in the root cellar, beneath the kitchen, where the thick walls and earthen floor muffled sound, and where they could speak without fear of being overheard by the house servants the Ashfords kept as informants. In that dim space, lit by a single tallow candle, Ruth laid out a truth that everyone present already knew, but had never spoken aloud in Kitty this way. "They will never let us be," she said, her voice low and steady. "There is no amount of submission that will satisfy them, no degree of obedience that will purchase our safety. We are born into their hands, and we will die in their hands, and our children will suffer the same, unless we act." The others listened, their faces grave. Samuel spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of his years. What action is there for us? We have no weapons, no allies. The war may free us, or it may not, but rebellion means death, and not just for us, but for everyone in the quarters. Ruth nodded, acknowledging the truth of this. She was not proposing a general uprising, which would be suicidal and would result in the massacre of innocent people. What she proposed was more targeted, more symbolic, and in its way more terrible. She proposed to destroy not just the Ashfords, but the very foundation of their authority, the institution that gave their cruelty the veneer of divine sanction. They hide behind the church, Ruth said. They use God to justify what they do to us. Every Sunday, the colonel sits in that front pew and listens to Reverend Whitfield preach about the curse of Ham and the natural order. Constance clutches her Bible and believes she is pious, while she watches her husband sell nursing mothers away from their babies. The church makes them feel righteous, so we take the church from them. The plan that emerged over the following months was both simple and audacious. They would burn the First Baptist Church with the Ashfords inside, making it appear as an accident, a tragedy that would be mourned rather than investigated too closely in the chaos of wartime. The others would have alibis, would be visible elsewhere, but Ruth would do the deed herself. She volunteered for this role with a calmness that frightened even those who loved her. She had calculated the cost and accepted it. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten stories, to the truths that the South tried to bury beneath monuments and mythology, consider subscribing to this channel. These stories deserve to be told, to be remembered, to stand as testimony to both the depths of human cruelty and the fierce resilience of those who resisted. The winter of 1862 passed into the spring of 1863. The war news was increasingly dire for the Confederacy. At Edgefield, life continued with a brittle normalcy, everyone pretending that the world they knew was not collapsing. Colonel Ashford became more erratic, more prone to sudden rages and equally sudden shows of generosity that seemed designed to prove to himself that he was still in control. Constance retreated further into religious mania, attending church 3 times a week, organizing prayer circles among the plantation women, and speaking constantly of God's plan and the righteousness of the Southern cause. Ruth played her role perfectly. She submitted to the colonel's breeding scheme without protest. She met with Samuel as commanded, and if what passed between them was not the violation the colonel intended, but rather a bitter communion between two people trapped in the same nightmare, the colonel remained ignorant of this distinction. She even began attending the prayer meetings Constance organized, sitting in the back of the room with the other enslaved women, her face a mask of piety that hid the calculations running beneath. She studied the church, noting the patterns of attendance, the layout of the building, the materials of its construction. The First Baptist Church was a wooden structure built in 1801 with pine floors and walls that had been painted white and whitewashed regularly for 60 years. The pews were old oak, dark with age and polish. The building had 2 doors, front and back, both of which could be barred from outside. There were windows, but they were high and narrow, designed more for light and ventilation. In the hot months, they were propped open, but in the cool of early spring, they remained closed. Ruth began bringing small amounts of materials into the church during the weeks leading up to her chosen date. She hid rags soaked in lard beneath the back pews. She loosened a board in the floor near the rear door, creating a space where she could store a small clay pot of coal oil she had stolen in tiny increments from the kitchen stores. She worked with the patience of someone who understood that haste would mean failure, and that failure would mean not just her death, but the deaths of everyone she was trying to protect. In a society where even love was property, where every human connection could be severed by a bill of sale, where resistance meant not just personal destruction but collective punishment, the very act of planning required a kind of madness. Or perhaps it required a clarity so poor that it appeared as madness to those who still believed in the possibility of accommodation, of survival through submission. The date Ruth chose was Sunday, April 12, 1863, exactly 2 years after the firing on Fort Sumter. There was a grim poetry in this timing that appealed to her sense of justice. The Reverend had announced a special service to pray for Confederate victory and to commemorate the beginning of the war. It would be well attended, but Ruth knew that the Colonel and Constance always arrived early and stayed late, using the time before and after the service to conduct the social business that was inseparable from worship in their world. The Sunday morning dawned cool and clear, the sky a pale blue marred by clouds. Ruth went about her duties with her usual efficiency, preparing breakfast, laying out Constance's clothes for church, ensuring that everything appeared normal. The Ashfords departed for church at 9:30, driven by Samuel in the closed carriage. Ruth watched them go, noting the time, calculating the sequence of events to come. She waited 30 minutes, then told Esther she was going to gather herbs from the woods behind the quarters, a task that would explain her absence. She took a basket to maintain the pretense, but instead of heading to the woods, she circled through the fields to approach the church from the rear, using the cover of a small grove of pines that stood between the cotton fields and the church property. The service had begun. She could hear the Reverend's voice carrying through the closed windows, the congregation joining in a hymn. She moved to the back door of the church, testing it gently. It was not locked. Churches were never locked during services. She slipped inside, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to be invisible. The interior of the church was dim despite the morning light, the high windows casting long shadows across the pews. The congregation was focused forward, toward the pulpit where Reverend Whitfield stood in his black coat, his Bible open before him. Ruth could see the backs of the Ashfords' heads in the front pew, the Colonel's grey hair and Constance's elaborate bonnet. There were perhaps 40 people in attendance, a respectable number for wartime. Ruth moved to the rear pew, where she had hidden her materials. Her hands were steady as she retrieved the rags and the coal oil. She worked quickly but without panic, soaking the rags more thoroughly, placing them at strategic points along the back wall and beneath the rear pews. She used the coal oil sparingly, knowing that too much would create an explosion rather than a fire, and an explosion might allow people to escape through the windows. When everything was in place, she took a small tinderbox from her pocket. She had stolen it months ago from the Colonel's study. She struck the flint, and a spark caught on the charred cloth. A tiny flame bloomed. She touched it to the nearest rag. The fire spread more slowly than she had anticipated, giving her time to move to the back door. She had planned to bar it from outside, to trap everyone inside. But in that moment, standing in the doorway, with the flames beginning to take hold behind her, she faltered. Through the gap between the pews, she could see the congregation, ordinary people singing a hymn about God's mercy. There were children present, daughters and sons of planters, brought to learn the rituals of their class. There were wives who, while complicit in the system, were themselves trapped by laws and customs that gave them no voice, no power beyond that which their husbands permitted. Ruth had not planned for this moment of hesitation, had not anticipated that her rage might be complicated by recognition of shared humanity, however limited. But the hesitation lasted only seconds. She thought of the children in the quarters, of the babies sold away from mothers who screamed until their voices broke, of young girls taken to the big house and returned pregnant and broken, of men whipped until the meat showed and then whipped again. She thought of Samuel's face when he spoke of his children, scattered across 3 states, sold to pay the colonel's gambling debts. She thought of her own mother, worked to death in the fields by the time she was 35. The hesitation passed. Ruth stepped outside, closed the door, and drove 2 wooden wedges beneath it, wedges she had carved weeks ago and hidden in the bushes beside the church. She moved to the front door and did the same. Then she walked calmly back toward the plantation, taking the long route through the fields, visible to anyone who might be watching, just another enslaved woman going about her errands. By the time she reached the quarters, smoke was visible above the tree line. By the time the alarm was raised and people began running toward the church, the flames had engulfed the back third of the building. By the time the first men reached the doors and discovered they were barred, the fire had created a roaring inferno that made approach impossible. 41 people died in the First Baptist Church that Sunday morning. Among them were Colonel Marcus Ashford and his wife, Constance, Reverend Whitfield, 3 other planters and their families, and a dozen children. Some died from smoke inhalation, mercifully unconscious before the flames reached them. Others died trying to break through the windows, their hands and faces pressed against the glass in those final moments. The church burned to its foundation, leaving only the stone steps and a scatter of melted glass and twisted metal from the oil lamps and the church bell. Consider for a moment the desperation required to commit such an act, the accumulated suffering and rage necessary to override every instinct toward self-preservation, every social conditioning toward submission. Consider also the moral void at the heart of slavery, a void so deep that it could drive even those not naturally inclined to violence toward acts of terrible retribution. The investigation was brief and inconclusive. In the chaos of 1863, with Sherman's army threatening from the west and the Confederate government collapsing from within, there was little appetite for a thorough inquiry. The official verdict was that a lamp had been knocked over during the service, that the fire had spread with tragic speed through the old dry wood, that the doors had swollen shut from the heat. No one could explain the wooden wedges found later in the ashes, but no one tried very hard. The alternative, that an enslaved person had committed mass murder in the most sacred space of the community, was too horrifying to contemplate and too dangerous to investigate, for it would have required acknowledging the rage that existed in every slave quarter, in every pair of eyes that looked up from the fields or down from the big house galleries. Ruth was questioned along with every other enslaved person on the Ashford plantation and in the surrounding area. She told the simple truth. She had been gathering herbs in the woods and had seen the smoke. Her alibi was weak, but no weaker than anyone else's. In the end, the white community chose to believe in accident rather than murder, chose to maintain the fiction of the contented slave rather than confront the reality of their own precarious position. In the immediate aftermath, the Ashford estate fell into administrative chaos. The colonel had died without clear heirs, his only son having been killed at Sharpsburg the previous year. The 10 cousins descended to claim the property, but by then the war was entering its final stages and the Confederacy's economy was collapsing. The plantation was eventually sold to pay debts, broken up into smaller parcels, the enslaved population dispersed to other properties, are, in some cases, simply abandoned to fend for themselves as the old order crumbled. Ruth survived. She was among a group of slaves sold to a smaller plantation in Georgia, a transaction that separated her from the others who had been her confederates in the original plan. Samuel, Dinah, Thomas, Esther, Moses, Clara, and Benjamin were scattered across the South, each carrying the knowledge of what Ruth had done, and each keeping that knowledge silent unto death. For to speak of it would be to invite questions about complicity, about foreknowledge, about the conversations that had taken place in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. When federal troops arrived in South Carolina in 1865, Ruth was among the thousands of newly freed people who began the long walk north, seeking family members, seeking work, seeking some life beyond bondage. She disappeared into the chaos of Reconstruction, leaving no clear record of her later years. Some oral stories from the period mention a woman matching her description who worked as a laundress in Charleston and who was known for her silence regarding her time on the plantations. Whether this was Ruth or another woman with a similar history is impossible to determine. The formerly enslaved learned quickly that certain stories were dangerous to tell, that the white South preferred its Negroes grateful and forgetful, and that survival in the new order required a careful amnesia about the old. The seat of the First Baptist Church remained empty for 3 years, the blackened foundation stones standing as a mute testimony to the April morning. Eventually, the congregation rebuilt on the same seat, a gesture of defiance and continuity. The new church was brick rather than wood, fireproof and solid, built to endure. It still stands today, though few who worship there know the full history of the ground beneath their feet. A small plaque commemorates the tragedy of 1863, listing the names of the dead and describing the fire as an accident that befell our community in the dark days of war. No mention is made of Ruth, of the enslaved community, of the system that created the conditions for such desperate violence. In the years following the war, as the White South constructed its mythology of the lost cause and the supposed harmony between enslaver and enslaved, stories like Ruth's were systematically suppressed. They contradicted the narrative of benevolent masters and content slaves that was essential to maintaining white supremacy in the absence of legal bondage. The violence of slavery was acknowledged only as individual aberrations, never as the systematic brutality that it was. The resistance of the enslaved was either erased entirely or recast as criminality rather than justified rebellion. But the stories persisted in the oral traditions of the black community, passed down through generations as cautionary tales and as reminders of what had been endured and survived. Ruth's story, like so many others, was told in fragments, the details changing with each telling, but the essential truth remaining, that there had been a woman who chose death over continued submission, who saw the church not as a house of God, but as the ideological fortress of her oppressors, who understood that in a system built on terror, only terror could speak with sufficient force. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson of Ruth's story is this, that slavery was not a benign institution made tragic by occasional excess, but a system of systematic terror that required constant violence to maintain. That the enslaved were not content but coerced, not loyal but trapped, not passive but calculating their survival day by day. That resistance took many forms, from the subtle and everyday to the spectacular and terrible, and that the moral responsibility for the violence of slavery lies not with those who resisted, but with those who created and maintained the system that made resistance necessary. As we continue to reckon with this history, to debate how it should be remembered and taught and memorialized, let us remember Ruth standing in the doorway of that church, watching the flames take hold, making a choice that would haunt the remainder of her days, but that she deemed necessary nonetheless. Let us remember that she was a human being, capable of love and hope and kindness, driven to desperate violence by a system that left her no other meaningful choice. Let us remember that her story, and thousands like it, are part of the American story, part of the foundation on which this nation was built, and that we cannot understand ourselves or our present until we face that past honestly and completely. The shadows of the South are long and dark, stretching across centuries and across the entire nation. They will not be dispelled by platitudes or by the comfortable mythology of reconciliation without justice, of forgiveness without acknowledgement, of progress that leaves the fundamental structures of racial hierarchy intact. They will be dispelled only when we look directly at the stories like Ruth's, when we resist the temptation to soften or sanitize, when we acknowledge the full horror of what was done, and the full humanity of those who suffered under and resisted it. This is the work that channels like Shadows of the South attempt to do, to excavate these buried stories, to give voice to the voiceless, to insist that these stories be told and heard and grappled with. It is uncomfortable work that challenges cherished narratives and forces difficult conversations. But it is necessary work if we are to build a future truly different from the past, if we are to honor the memory of Ruth and the countless others who paid with their lives for the sin of demanding recognition of their humanity. So we remember Ruth of South Carolina, who burned a church and everyone in it on a spring morning in 1863, who disappeared into the chaos of Reconstruction and carried her secret to whatever grave finally claimed her. We remember her not to celebrate violence, but to understand the conditions that produced it, to acknowledge the rage that fueled it, to acknowledge the rage that fueled it, to recognize the humanity that demanded it. We remember so that we might never again create a society that drives people to such desperate extremity, that reduces human beings to property and then acts surprised when they rebel against their reduction. We remember because forgetting would be the final insult, the ultimate denial of the suffering and the resistance and the cost of freedom.